For more, we're joined by Peter Churchouse, Director of Lim Advisors, live from our Hong Kong studios. Peter, very nice to have you with us. Indeed, we've just had reports that Japan is likely to grant a debt moratorium or freeze to the affected nations. There are other countries such as Britain, the US, Germany and France, which are also urging similar moves. I'm wondering, though, about the potential negative impact of that in light of the fact that Indonesia's finance minister, for one, said we could see ratings downgrades by ratings agencies such as S&P, which would in the future raise borrowing costs for those affected nations.
Well, I think first off, when we're looking at the impacts immediately on these nations, I think the first thing that we think of is the impact on tourism. Firstly, how big a role does tourism play in these economies? And secondly, how big a negative impact on visitor arrivals is likely to happen here? In the case of Thailand, for example, tourism accounts for just under 6% of GDP, but in Indonesia it's around 2%, and in India it's only 0.75%. So Thailand clearly could be more affected than other countries here in terms of tourism impacts. If we look at in terms of visitor arrivals, we can perhaps get some insights from previous disasters and crises in the region. For example, after the Asian financial crisis and the 9/11 incident, visitor arrivals in Asia fell by between 22 and 26%. After the SARS incident in 2003, it was down by 60-something%. But after the Bali bombing, tourism arrivals were down by less than 5%. So my sense here is it's probably more likely to be an effect similar to the Bali incident rather than the SARS incident. So I think the impact on tourism is likely to be relatively modest and probably more focused in Thailand than some other countries.
Indeed, and even though Thailand, as you say, may be one of the worst hit because of the tourism impact, is also one of the countries with the most resources to try and counter that. Also, with the pledges, as Fazia said, totaling up to nearly US dollars 5 billion, to what extent will that help mitigate the overall impact, economically speaking, of the tsunami disaster?
Well, absolutely. I think that will be a very major factor here. Of course, there will be a lot of rebuilding in these countries and all of the countries affected, and that will act as a fiscal stimulus to the domestic economy, whether that comes in the form of aid or domestic sources, whether it comes in debt moratoriums or whatever. It will be a fiscal stimulus which will counterbalance or counterbalance some of the negative effects through things like tourism and lost production in fishing and agriculture and so on. And these fiscal injections I think will result in ultimately the impact on GDP in these countries being very minimal to the downside in the coming year. Perhaps Thailand is likely to be the most affected, but in Indonesia and India, we don't expect to see a negative impact on the GDP numbers at all. Of course, it's horrendous for the people locally who are concerned, but at the macro level, it's likely to have very little impact. In Thailand, we're expecting about 2 or 0.3% negative impact here as a result of this disaster.
My next question might be a little bit harder to quantify, though, Peter. Even if indeed we see the tourism industry in these countries get back on its feet, hotels being rebuilt, railways and roads being repaired, because of whole communities being wiped out, mothers losing children, children losing their parents, there's obviously a huge social and psychological impact here. Could that have longer term a trickle-down effect to the economy?
Well, yes, of course, to the extent that it's very hard to quantify, obviously, but there will need to be long-term care situations put in place for children who are orphaned, families who are broken up and so on. And I think there will be long-term social welfare costs involved here. But again, in the total scale of countries such as Indonesia or Thailand, these are probably, yes, they're negative, but they're likely to be a relatively small part of an overall GDP over the long term, and certainly in the case of a country such as India with a much and a much bigger economy. But certainly there will be negative things for the local community, which the local communities will have to bear the cost of to a large extent, and that may impede or impinge on the way in which these small local economies can recover from this disaster.
Peter, thank you very much for your comments. Peter Churchouse joining us from Lim Advisors live in Hong Kong.